What's that shit on your chest?
Crisco, Bardol, Vagisil. Any one of them will give you another 2 to 3 inches drop on your curveball. Of course, if the umps are watching me close, I just rub a little jalapeno inside my nose, get it running, and if I need to load the ball up a little, just wipe my nose.
You put snot on the ball?
Haven't got an arm like yours. I gotta put anything on it I can find. Someday you will, too.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. On today's show, I have David Vaught. He is the author of a new book about Gaylord Perry. It is called Spitter, Baseball's Notorious Gaylord Perry. It is from Texas A&M University Press. And it was fun to talk with David for a number of reasons. It's pretty much my first baseball podcast, I think, or my first one dedicated to a major baseball player. I've talked a little bit about the game on some previous podcasts, I think, but not a lot. I've been a lifelong fan, and so has David, and his book is a really impressive piece of scholarship. He's done a lot of research. There aren't a lot of archival sources out there on Gaylord Perry, but there are a lot of newspaper clippings and other writings. Gaylord Perry himself put out a biography, an autobiography, I guess, in the 1970s, but it was written by a journalist. But there's a lot of published things, but not the kind of guy that you can go to his papers at the Library of Congress or Chapel Hill or someplace like that and get all the information you need or a good chunk of it. So it had certain challenges in terms of getting sources. Gaylord Perry was not a guy who went to college and wrote a lot of letters or anything. So David really scoured the newspapers in North Carolina when Gaylord Perry was coming up, but also later when he was a major league pitcher. He had a pretty amazing career. He is a Hall of Famer. He won more than 300 games, which is the gold standard for a starting pitcher. But he was controversial, as the subtitle of this book implies. Notorious, definitely controversial. He threw a spitball for most of his career. He was struggling for a while, but once he kind of mastered the spitball, that's when he started becoming a 20-game winner, and he won the Cy Young Award twice, one in each league. So he had many accomplishments and was really of a different time, not just in terms of throwing the spitter, but also in what was expected of a starting pitcher. I mean, you were expected to go all 9 innings. You would throw, at least 200 innings a year, often more than 300. Perry threw more than 300 for many of his seasons. When he was in prime, I think he was probably averaging 300 innings a year. So a very different ball game. They weren't all throwing 98, 99 miles an hour like they are now, but they could go the distance, and they were really competitive. In addition to being a true character, Gaylord Perry was a serious competitor. He was a little bit before my time. I remember him kind of toward the very end of his career. I would get baseball cards with him on it, but I don't ever remember seeing him pitch. Maybe I did on TV once or twice when I was really young, but I don't remember him, and there's really not a lot of footage of him. But he had his super sinker that really mystified batters for a long time. So I always knew of him, but I was watching baseball, for the first time, 83, 84, and by then Perry had been retired. So it was really fun to read this book. I've got another baseball book I've been working on, but when I found out about this, I was really eager to get into it. And David has provided sometimes a pitch by pitch account, game to game, year to year, certainly, but sometimes pitch to pitch if Perry was in a tight game. But one of the things about him is he never really played for great teams. And the Giants had some good years. He also pitched for Cleveland, which was terrible. Even though he'd have good years, the Cleveland team was not doing so hot, and he pitched for the Braves too. So he really got around because he was kind of difficult. That competitive streak certainly kind of went to his head, and it was not always great with teammates and with management. A very interesting guy. Whatever you think about the spitter and his legacy, he's definitely one of the best pitchers of all time statistically, no doubt about that. and was a really interesting book that delves into Perry's background in addition to the pitching career, talking about him growing up in North Carolina in the tobacco fields. And in a lot of ways, David and I have kind of gone down similar paths with our books, me with Cash and him with Gaylord Perry, providing a lot of context about poverty in the South. Certainly had kind of parallel lives growing up in very rural areas of the South that depended on a cash crop, Cash with the cotton and Perry with the tobacco. So if you like Southern history, this is definitely an interesting take on a major baseball player. So I remember reading an article about this about 10 years ago that came out, and I really enjoyed the article. And then Gaylord Perry died recently. So I Googled his name and this book came up. So I was like, okay, I got to talk to this guy. So David and I have a very, very interesting discussion. He talks about his love of the Giants growing up in the Bay Area. And then we eventually get into Gaylord Perry's career and his legacy. So pretty long talk, but hey, spring training will be here before you know it. So it's good to get in the baseball mindset already. All right. Well, I hope you enjoy this, my talk with Dr. David Vaught. Thanks for talking with me today, and I really enjoyed the book. You did a terrific job with Perry and laying out his life and career and everything. But as I like to do on the podcast, I kind of like to take a holistic approach and go into historians' backgrounds a little bit. So in looking at your CV, the fact that you went to school in San Francisco and you've written about one of the Giants, I'm guessing you are from California. Is that true?
I wasn't born in California, but I was raised there in the city of El Cerrito, which is just north of Berkeley, in the San Francisco Bay Area in the East Bay.
Okay.
Suburb.
And you did, let's see, your master's and your BA at San Francisco State?
Yeah, I was I guess you'd call me a non-traditional student. My father was a math professor
Okay.
at Berkeley. And in my first college go-around, which was out of high school at Pomona College, a small liberal arts college in Southern California, I tried to follow in his footsteps and failed miserably.
So you were not a math guy.
Well, I kind of thought I was.
Yeah.
Math is somewhat of an odd subject because you don't really know what you're getting into until you start taking like your junior level classes. It just becomes a much different thing.
Yeah.
And, man, I just hit the wall. It was traumatic, actually. I mean, I left school.
So I'm sorry to hear that.
No, it wasn't so bad. I mean, I left school, and then I worked for 6 years as truck driver in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay.
Swearing I'd never go back to school, let alone academia. It took me 6 years to get bored. I went back to San Francisco State, which was a perfect place because it's really a place for non-traditional students.
Yeah.
It wasn't at all out of place there. And for the first time in my life, I took a lot of different kinds of courses. Had a history course that blew my mind. Started taking more history courses and just never stopped. I had fantastic teachers at San Francisco State to just turn me on to history.
Well, that's good. I think it's probably better to get the trauma over early with in your career path. Maybe you kind of made that decision. Sounds early on rather than when you're 40 or 45,
Yeah, better to have it early than in midlife. Yeah, I think that's
not that it's ever good to have it, but I think, some people, and especially now, just the way the professions are with academia and stuff. I mean, it's kind of going through a crisis now. Maybe it always has been, but your dad was at Berkeley. So was he there kind of like the height of late 60s, early 70s Berkeley with all the activism and everything?
Oh yeah, I can remember him coming home, with the tear gas in his eyes.
Oh wow!
that sort of thing.
Was he sympathetic towards the more progressive elements, or where was he kind of politically?
More toward that.
Okay.
My mother was exactly the opposite. She hated hippies and counterculture, all that stuff.
Where was she from?
She's from Nebraska.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting background. I know you didn't want to really go down mathematics that road, but as a baseball fan, you need to know some statistics, definitely. And it's just become more and more part of the game, it seems. When did you start getting interested in baseball? Because Spitter is not your first book about baseball, but I'm guessing you've been a fan for a while.
Gosh, I've been a baseball fan as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
I was talking about this with my wife last night, and there's absolutely no reason for me to be a baseball fan. My parents were not sports fans. I mean, I think the first thing they did in the morning was remove the sports page from the paper and throw it away. I had no uncle or neighbor or anything that turned me on to it. It was just something that kids played right away, first grade. But I was really got hooked on it when I started listening to the radio broadcasts, San Francisco Giants, and listening to them way past my bedtime. And I was just enthralled by the whole process of listening to a game on the radio. The Giants had fantastic announcers, Russ Hodges, Lon Simmons, legendary announcers who could put you right there during the game. Each game was its own narrative, with its own central theme and sub themes. I couldn't get enough of it, and it sort of gave me my own. Very early on, it gave me my own identity apart from my parents. Which I guess I really enjoyed.
So, do you remember when Gaylord Perry was pitching for them?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
I was born in 1958, but so probably by the late 60s, I was listening. I've been following the Giants closely and devouring the sports page every day. I do remember there was a specific game. It was because it was the game that Willie Mays got his 3,000th hit. It was in 1970, and Perry was pitching. Perry was pitching that game. I mean, I was so into it. I used to sneak away. As early as 10 or 12 years old, I would go by myself to Candlestick Park on the bus.
Wow.
Which was a difficult process. I mean, somebody must have showed me how to do it, but it involved two long bus rides and a walk through a very bad part of town in between those two bus rides. But I knew too that the games then in the afternoon started at I believe 12:15, and if the games went long, I knew exactly what time I had to leave in order to retrace my steps, make sure I got home in time for dinner. My parents never knew. Added to the whole thrill of it. But I can still see myself at those games. I was just enchanted with it.
Yeah. And it's a pretty amazing experience when you go to your first major league game. And what you're talking about, like going on the bus and going in through the city it doesn't happen anymore.
No.
I grew up in Massachusetts, so I was a Sox fan, but I was very far from Boston, so we couldn't do something like that. But I mean, maybe I would have when I was a kid. I don't know, but things have just changed so much.
You had a sense of independence.
Right.
My parents, quite frankly, didn't really care where I was during the day, as long as I was home on time.
Yeah.
We were very unsupervised.
Yeah, Again, I didn't do anything quite that dramatic, but I mean, yeah, I'd be gone all day, and there were no cell phones, and maybe you would call, maybe you wouldn't, but you'd literally be gone from morning till dark a lot of the time. So that's kind of sad. That's disappeared. But so when do the A's come in? They are the other team in the Bay Area. They're right across from the Giants. When did the Oakland A's set up shop?
1968 was their
Okay.
first year, and I never had any interest in the A's, even though they were much closer.
Yeah.
And they, particularly in the 70s, were by far the superior team. My heart was with and loyalties were with the Giants. I think most of my friends were Giants fans, and we looked down on A's fans. They wore these what we thought were silly uniforms with white shoes and looked like clowns. They of course they won 3 world championships in the 70s, but it didn't sway me. We went to a few games, especially as I got older. The Oakland Coliseum was a just miserable stadium. It was even worse than Candlestick. I actually loved Candlestick.
I don't have a great memory of Candlestick Park. I kind of vaguely remember it when I was a kid, collecting baseball cards and reading about baseball and stuff. But it had a reputation of being a cold and windy place. You talk about that there was this big hill you had to climb to get into the stadium.
Particularly before, the stadium was enclosed, about 1971 or so, because the 49ers moved into it and they greatly enlarged the stadium. But before the stadium was enclosed, the wind, which just comes in from the Pacific Ocean through these gaps in the hills and just flow directly into the stadium, swirl around. I mean, you'd have to, in July, August, you'd have to go to, particularly at night games, but day games too. I mean, you'd have to bring your parka. And the night games, man, you better bring a blanket and gloves. It was just miserable, and a miserable place for the players. And only later did people really start writing about it, and that how much the effect of the stadium had on the team's performance, especially in the 70s and the 80s. Nobody wanted to play there. It was just a boondoggle.
So, but was it a good pitching stadium?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a very good pitching stadium, but the players tried to make it their home field advantage. Visiting teams just hated it, but it was miserable. But it was my stadium, so
right.
I didn't really think much about it, and I actually thought it was fun.
Well, I think probably any fan who doesn't go to a stadium that's a dome probably has stories about a day I was there. It was 38 degrees and, there was flurries or something. I mean, Fenway can be cold in April. It can be cold in October. Like, there's a sort of hardiness to the people that are going outdoors anyway. But it's like the dome stadiums I've always kind of looked down upon a little bit. It's like, well, you guys play indoors, good for you. 81 times a year, you have perfect weather.
I mean, the other thing about the A's arrival is that it severely cut into the Giants' attendance. I mean, really, the Giants and the A's together for years drew about the same that the Giants drew by themselves. So it just was a bad scene. The Giants almost went bankrupt in the 1970s.
Yeah, I didn't really know that. I mean, I growing up, you always knew there were 2 teams in the Bay Area, and as you say, Oakland was better in the 70s, and then again, kind of in the late 80s. The Giants, there was that one Subway Series in '89 where they both played each other, but wasn't Giants got a new stadium. I'm guessing they draw a lot better now than they probably did in the 70s, right?
Oh yeah, they draw near especially when they were winning World Series 10 years ago. They were, sold out every game.
And much more comfortable stadium
No,
now too.
I've only been to the new stadium. It's not even new anymore, but two or three times. And frankly, I really didn't like it.
Yeah.
It was a whole different demographic than Candlestick Park. It wasn't anywhere near as raucous as Candlestick used to be. And the Candlestick, you could go to Candlestick and there'd be 2,500, 3,000 people there. It was just the old joke was during Patty Hearst was on the run. The old joke was that she was hiding in the upper deck at Candlestick Park because nobody had been there for years.
Right. And now kind of the A's are going through that, right? I mean, they're drawing terribly.
Yeah, their stadium is just a hideous place.
Too much foul territory since day one.
That's part of it, and it's just one huge piece of concrete.
Yeah.
It has kind of a nice view into the East Bay Hills, but it has no character or charm. It's just for years it's been called the mausoleum as opposed to the Coliseum.
Well, you do a really good job on this with putting Perry in context and everything, and you talk a lot about him growing up in North Carolina. You said you're a Giants fan, obviously, and have been for a long time. Was it because Perry was on the Giants, and you kind of grew up watching the late '60s, early '70s teams that you wanted to write? Why Perry? I guess is what I'm saying.
Not really.
Yeah.
That ultimately kind of added to the attraction, and just the Giants. The fact that his first 10 years in the big leagues and his first 14 years were with the San Francisco Giants organization, and that made it fun for me. But it's not ultimately why I did the book. I mean, the book sort of grew out of my previous book, The Farmer's Game, which allowed me to, my profession is history. My passion was baseball. And by then I was a full professor. I could do whatever the heck I wanted. And it gave me a chance to combine the two. So that book was a series of case studies that proceeded sort of chronologically and in various regions of the country. So started in central New York and actually Cooperstown in the early 19th century, prior to when Abner Doubleday supposedly invented the game in 1839. The essay on baseball in Sacramento Valley, which in the late 19th century, which grew out of my previous book on California agriculture. Central Texas in the early 20th century. Iowa in the early and mid 20th century through Bob Feller. This little town in southwest Minnesota called Milroy, middle 20th century. And by the time I sort of had realized that that's what I was doing, I thought, I really needed something from the South. And I don't really remember how I stumbled along Gaylord Perry. It may have been through he wrote with a journalist, a sort of quasi autobiography in his mid-career that talks a little bit about his upbringing in the sharecropper family. So that intrigued me, and I pursued it. And at some point, this was probably back starting in 2008, 2009. And at some point, I thought, there might really be a larger project here. Not really a problem, but the problem for me was that I was served as department head for my department for 2 terms, from 2011 to 2019. This was really a full-time administrative job that didn't leave me a whole lot of time, certainly not the normal amount of time I would have for for research. So did the research in spurts, a week here, a few hours there, a couple of weeks over the summer. And I never really knew if I really had anything, because I would come home and just put all my stuff on the shelf and not even look at it.
Yeah. Well, I remember you wrote an article on Perry. I think it was the Journal of Southern History about 10 years ago.
Yeah, so it was published in 2000, all of 2011, I believe. And gosh, I remember writing it, and I just sent it in on a lark. I mean, I didn't think I had a chance in hell to get it published. And in fact, the original readers' reports trashed it.
Really?
But the editor, a guy named John Bowles, and his associate editor turned out to be baseball fans and were always trying to expand the boundaries of Southern history. And here is sort of popular culture, if you will. And the article is largely about his years growing up in Eastern North Carolina, and then his years after his baseball career in farming in Eastern North Carolina. There's really nothing about his baseball career, but doing that, and then they said, well, here, listen to what their referees are saying, and send it in, see if you can fix it up, and I almost gave up on it because I just didn't think it had a chance. But I spent another few weeks on it and sent it in, and they accepted it within an hour after I sent it in. And that gave me, when you write books, it's all about confidence, because you have no confidence in what you're doing when you start a project. And that gave me the confidence to proceed, that maybe I really had something here.
I remember when your article on Perry came out in the Journal of Southern History, and honestly, most of the time I'll just go to the book reviews, read a couple book reviews, because the articles are just not very interesting, just not for me anyway, nothing to do with the scholarship per se. But when I saw that article on Perry, I said, well, this is something I really want to read. And I remember reading the entire article and thinking it was really good. I don't read a lot of academic articles on baseball, and certainly had never read anything on Perry before. So that was very interesting. I'm glad you finished that.
It all depends on who the editor is, but most editors are really looking for, most of the submissions are same old, whatever the hot topic is, at the time, kind of thing. And they're looking for things that are original. So it's, I tell students this, and tell myself over and over again, for what have I been doing this for 25 years now? You have to follow your instincts and trust your instincts. And that sounds a lot easier than it is. If you do that, then what you write and what you do is going to come from deep within you, and you're likely to write about it much better. And this particular project, particularly the book, more so than my previous books, it's just entirely my own invention, my own thing, and I don't give a damn what anybody else thinks about it. You have the luxury when you're a full professor, but that's what made the whole process ultimately so very satisfying, probably more satisfying than anything I've done. The other thing about it was that both Southern history, and particularly in this time period, in the mid to late 20th century, both of those were new to me. So I had to really go take a crash course in Southern history, and I asked people, my friends, what do I need to read? I'm studying about this guy who grew up in the 40s and the 50s in the Tobacco Belt, North Carolina. What do I need to read? And so it was all really fresh to me, which just added to the challenge and to the enjoyment.
I think we're seeing this shift in scholarship with pop culture figures after the Second World War. I mean, I've written a book on Cash. You've written this book on Perry. I have a friend who's writing a book of essays. He's editing a book of essays on Bob Dylan. So, these things are starting to get into the historiography. And a lot of times there's really not much out there on what you've written, or at least not anything very scholarly. So you can really carve your own path with certain pop culture figures, if you want to call them that.
Yeah, and actually, I didn't really give a damn about historiography either. I wanted to make sure I was accurate.
Yeah.
And that. So, gosh, I can't think of the author's author's name. But there's a book about growing up in the South growing up white in a small town, segregated town, in pretty much exactly this time period, the 40s and the 50s, when Gaylord came of age. And that was helpful. Just a number of books were helpful for me to kind of put what I was getting about him in for context.
Yeah.
So I remember the first draft probably of that article I had, or maybe I was just talking about it. A friend of mine who's not even a historian, but she's actually from Eastern North Carolina. And I referred to the farm as a tobacco ranch. Ranch is a sort of California term.
Right.
She's horrified by that. And I remember distinctly her reaction and thinking, I've got a lot to learn about, because I can't make those kinds of. She said, it's a farm. That's ranch doesn't exist in the South.
Yeah, that's more of a Texas, California, Southwest kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you go to where he's from and kind of look around and method act a little?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I had to go. I mean, he's from the tobacco town, Eastern North Carolina, just littered with small towns that used to be tobacco towns, where people brought their crops in to be sold. And that town was Williamston, which is completely isolated. I mean, it's 100 miles east of Raleigh and about 100 miles south of Norfolk, Virginia. Those are the two biggest cities of any size. And back then, we were talking about 3-hour drives. But and he was from a rural community outside of that town that they called farm life appropriately. So to access the local newspaper, the only institution that had a full run of that newspaper was the public library in Williamston. So I spent a lot of time there. I had this old rinky-dink reader printer, that I had to learn all the tricks of, because it would malfunction all the time. That I became very, very good at. And I spent a lot of time there then. And I kind of drove around by myself, not really knowing exactly what I was looking at. But then the real breakthrough was, and to get back to your question, in the summer of 2019, which was my last summer as department head. So I knew I was going to be back in my faculty life starting that, September 1. But that summer, I went to Williamston. By then, I was in touch with one of Gaylord's family members. His second daughter and I had long conversations, and it was difficult to talk with her on the phone or via email, because it'd be stop and go. So I said, look, why don't I just come out there and you can maybe, you can show me around. And she lived in near Raleigh and took me out there, and she was able to show me around the area. And then even more so, just serendipitously, we met this guy whose name is Heber Coltrane, who was kind of the unofficial historian, genealogist of this neighborhood that Perry grew up in. And on the spur of the moment, I mean, he took me on a tour, an insider's tour of the region, and talked with me about all kinds of things. I mean, he proved to be my most informative contact. And that gave me the lay of the land, the image of it. I could, through Google Maps, the satellite maps, I could recreate the drive. You can sort of drive through the satellite map. I could recreate, because he would tell me, this is where so and so lived, and this is where here was this is these rural southern farming communities. There's no commercial district or anything. There's just like the school, the mill, the store, and the church. So I had all of this in my head at just exactly the right time, because I was just then really ready to start to throw myself into the writing of it. So the timing of that, I had the image of it, and all this information from this guy. It was just perfect timing.
Yeah, well, published a book on Johnny Cash in summer last year, and what you're talking about, small communities, is true for me too. It's like you can be there. It's not even a big area, maybe, but if you're looking for a specific thing, sometimes you just have to ask somebody. I mean, it's like there's maybe no marker, or it's not on the GPS. You had kind of a guide, but like I've had that experience too, where like you just end up kind of talking to locals, and they might know, like, oh yeah, the markers, down this road, you take a left on gravel road or whatever. That's kind of essential.
I think it's probably similar. I mean, these roads in this area were unnamed.
Yeah.
In fact, were unnamed until I think it was the late 80s.
Yeah.
When the phenomenon of 911 made them name the roads, so vehicles could. Otherwise, it was just down the road from the mill, that kind of thing.
Right.
A lot of the roads weren't even really roads; they were some cartways. About the experience of actually being there is that you just get, rather than just reading about it, you get a real sense of the geography of the place. And eastern North Carolina, sort of naturally, or ecologically, is a solid pine forest. So these tobacco farms were literally carved out. The typical size was 25 acres of people, manually with mules pulling out tree stumps.
Yeah.
And tobacco requires, the end process requires a drying process where you're in a tobacco barn that's fueled by a wood burning furnace. So in the off months of the fall and the winter, they're constantly chopping down trees, pulling out stumps, and chopping firewood. They have to have massive amounts of firewood in order to carry out the drying process. It just brings all that more vividly to life when you actually see it. I mean, it's just mind-boggling.
Well, it's funny because I haven't really read a whole lot about North Carolina over the years. I mean, when you get into grad school, you're thrown into the deep end, and you tend to read a lot of things about Virginia and maybe South Carolina from the colonial period onward. I guess because Virginia and South Carolina are so important politically that North Carolina kind of gets overlooked. The irony being now, in North Carolina, population of the state is much bigger than either Virginia or South Carolina, and it's become a major player politically in the Mid-South, and politicians getting electoral votes and everything. But what I liked about this book too is you don't just get the baseball, you get his background, his poor family, and he had a really contentious relationship with his brother. But I forget, did he also have a sister?
A much younger sister who was, most likely an accident. And she was a problem because she wasn't a boy. And
Yeah.
they were the two boys, his brother is 3 years older. They're primarily farm laborers and take on full adult responsibilities by when they're 7 years old, starting at age 7, including driving a plow behind 2 mules. Tobacco, really, I didn't know much about this. Tobacco is much different than cotton. I mean, the whole process is much different. It's much more labor intensive. The crop itself is much more fragile and meticulous. And so that necessitates much sort of stronger relationships between landowner and tenant. Tenants were much more likely to stay put with the same landowner once the landowner had full trust in the tenant's abilities to produce high quality tobacco. And it's really sort of skilled labor.
And you talk about his relationship with his older brother Jim, who's also a major league pitcher. Talk about their relationship, because they have a rivalry there, but maybe talk about kind of how that starts and how it persists later.
So his brother Jim is a very good major league pitcher. I mean, won 215 games. I mean, had a very good career in his own right. But their rivalry is rooted in their upbringing. I don't want to go spend too much time on talking about how you grow and produce tobacco, but it's hard, hard labor. And Jim was 3 years older, so he was the first one to go to do it. And so parents who's very non-sentimental people, they don't have time to be sentimental.
Right.
All the attention was focused on Jim in that way, again, sort of by necessity. So Gaylord was always in Jim's shadow. They growing up in this manner, they were together, like literally together, virtually all day and all night, even, because they slept in the same bed.
Right.
Every single day until Jim went to started high school. So, and both are competing with for their parents' attention, but most of that attention went to Jim. They were both very long, 6'4", 180 or so in high school, tall, wiry, and strong, from large part from being farm workers so long. Strong hands and very good athletes. The father was a semi-pro player who was a good athlete. So Jim was a star in high school in the town of Williamston there. High school probably had about 350 students or so. And all the attention went to Jim. I mean, that was both a plus and a minus for Gaylord, but he was expected to follow in his brother's footsteps, but his brother also kind of paved the way for him. And his brother attracted, it's called what you should call bird dog scouts. These were all scouting for baseball back then was all word of mouth, face to face and word of mouth. There were no computers or anything, of course. And Jim was scouted by this guy named Earl Smith, who was the coach at Campbell College, which was much closer to Raleigh than it was to Williamston. And while he was scouting Jim, this would have been 1955 or so, he also got a look at Gaylord, Jim was in his junior year. Gaylord was in his freshman year. They were actually 3 years apart, but only 2 grades apart because both of them were held behind in school. As this was typical for these sorts of kids, because again they were laborers first, and they missed, the laws were such, or you missed certain amounts of school, you had to repeat the grades. And Jim repeated 2 grades, and Gaylord repeated 1. So Jim became a high school star. Jim was drafted by the Cleveland Indians. He moved up through the minors. It took him only 3 years to join the big team in Cleveland, where he had success right away. Gaylord took was 4 years in the minors, and then 2 years up and down between San Francisco and the minors. Gaylord really struggled while Jim was prospering. Then Jim had a kind of a lull in his career, but came back in 1970. He went 24-12 that year, won the American Cy Young Award. Gaylord was 23-13, came in second for the Cy Young Award. I mean, they were just in constant competition. Jim was also smarter. He was much better in school. He was much better looking. To this day, he has a full head of hair. Gaylord bald as an egg by the time in his late 20s. And he was much more practically minded. Jim, in the off season, went to college. He graduated and became a highly successful businessman in Minneapolis after his baseball career, while Gaylord went back to farming and went bankrupt in 1986. So there was constant, intense competition between the two. And really, after Jim left high school, the brothers rarely spoke to each other. One of Gaylord's daughters told me that she could count on one hand the number of times the two families had crossed paths over the years.
Yeah, it's
beyond the professional part of it. There were always, personal things when the father dies, when the mother dies, that just they really had a strong sibling rivalry.
Yeah, it's kind of sad to read about, and it didn't seem, as you laid out, it wasn't like there was this one awful argument or one awful day where they wouldn't speak to each other. It's just kind of this years of competition and resentment and whatever. Because even Jim aside, I mean, Gaylord was a really strong competitor. I mean, you make that very clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was always driven by lots of things. I mean, his father, the father drove the two of them hard in the fields, but equally hard growing up playing baseball. The three of them would play together. And again, Jim won every time. Jim was 3 years older.
Right, yeah.
And Jim won his parents' favor, especially particularly his father, and really I think Gaylord spent in some way, I don't want to get too psychology 101 here, but he spent most of his life, I think the rest of his life, in some ways, always trying to please his father.
Yeah. Well, and that's another thing I liked about the book was, again, you just read so many books where people are just kind of dropped from the sky, like they don't talk about family life. They don't talk about the family dynamics. And you're right, you can't get too Freudian with it, but it's obviously all there. There's this competitive streak between the brothers, and the father's kind of a hard guy. It doesn't seem like there was any, I mean, I don't know, like the dad didn't have a drinking problem or anything like that. Was there anything like that?
No.
And Gaylord never really did either, right? He didn't have any problems like that.
Nope. In fact, his mother would have killed. I don't think Gaylord, particularly, drinking was prevalent, of course, amongst baseball players.
Yeah.
But he didn't, not until he was in his early 40s did he didn't even have a glass of wine.
Yeah.
His mother, who was a staunchly religious, would have never allowed it. So no, it was all just part of his life and growing up. But the thing about the books, and you know this, you when you start a project, you never know where it's going to go.
Right.
And you have to get lucky. You have to get lucky that the book and the various themes and sub themes continue to grow as the book and your research grows, rather than just ends and you're really sort of stuck at there's nothing else to do. I mean, it just kept growing and growing and getting better, and especially when I got the chance to really talk to some of his family members and the like. It just it kept getting harder because there were more and more things to kind of put together. But in the end, it was great. It was great fun and a real challenge, and again, really just a really satisfying project.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about their strength physically. I mean, obviously the game has changed so much now, but you read about these guys in the 60s and 70s, guys like Perry, Ryan is kind of the perfect example. Like, they're going 300 plus innings some years, and they're, like you said, you go like 23-13 or 21-19. Like, that just doesn't happen anymore. 25 complete games or whatever they would have. I mean, it's just astounding the endurance level they had.
Gaylord's best year was his first year with Cleveland in 1972. And I can't remember how, it was over 350 innings, but he had 40 starts, never missed a start, 29 complete games, pitched deep into extra innings many times. The Saber Nuts will tell you that it was one of the best, through all their various metrics and things, one of the best years that a right-handed pitcher had in the 20th century, given that the Indians were a horrible, horrible team. And he went 24-12, he had an ERA below 1.9 something. It was just a spectacular season. He was the ultimate workhorse. I mean, in terms of his numbers, I mean, you could really argue he was the all-time workhorse at least in the modern era. There's only two competitors. If you take away old-timers like Cy Young and Walter Johnson, there's only two competitors were Phil Niekro, who threw just less than 100 innings more. But Niekro threw the knuckleball, which a very low-stress pitch for the arm. And then Ryan was the other, who maybe had 30 innings more than Perry, but Ryan pitched for 5 more years than Perry. Perry was also, nobody remembers him as a strikeout pitcher, but he actually broke Walter Johnson's all-time record in 1983, a record at the time that was thought to be insurmountable. Coincidentally, the same year, both Ryan and Steve Carlton also broke the record in 1983, and Ryan went on to obliterate it. I mean, Ryan had 5,700 strikeouts.
And Gaylord Perry is a little before my time. I think when I started watching baseball, like around 83 or 84, he had been retired, but I knew about him and his records because he retired in 83, right?
83, and most people who remember him in the latter stages of his career, when he was, old, fat, grumpy, really moving year to year from one really bad team to another in this really sort of desperate pursuit to get to 300 wins. But there's just so much more to him than that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the spitter, and because that's kind of what he's known for, either for good or ill. Maybe kind of put him in context in terms of spitball pitchers at the time. I mean, it had been outlawed for a long time, but he wasn't alone in throwing it. I mean, you talk about some other guys in the book who I didn't know about that were also suspected of throwing the spitter, like Don Don Sutton from the Dodgers, and some other folks. Maybe just kind of talk about, I guess, for lack of a better term, the history of the spitball and how he came to be associated with that.
Well, I mean, a lot of people tried, particularly in the 60s, a lot of people tried to throw the spitter, but it took me a while to explain the mechanics of it.
Sure.
It's really difficult pitch to master. And then, of course, you have to hide it because
Right.
it's against, I mean, it's not illegal, but it's against the rule since 1920. But in 1920, when they outlawed the spitter, each team was allowed to sort of set aside two of their pitchers who were spitballers, and those pitchers were allowed to continue through the end of their career. They were sort of grandfathered into the rule. And all of these spitball pitchers in the 60s, late 50s, 60s, Lou Burdette, Whitey Ford, Don Drysdale, Bill Singer, Jim Maloney, Bob Shaw, who was the most important person in terms of Perry. There's almost a genealogy to these pitchers because they had all ultimately learned, through pun intended, through word of mouth, how to throw the spitball, and ultimately could trace those roots back to some of these grandfathered spitballers. It was sort of fascinating.
Yeah.
In that regard. And Perry, again, was really struggling to first to get to the majors. There were only then 20 teams in the major leagues, 10-man pitching staffs, tons and tons of minor league teams. I mean, the chances, the odds, the numbers were so stacked against you. And 62, he made the team, but he really still spent more time at AAA than he did in the majors. 63, again, he made the team, but again was sent back. 64, and really by that time, the only reason the Giants hadn't released him or cut him was because they gave him this enormous bonus in 1958. So they were much more patient with him than they might have been otherwise. And in 1964, they traded for Bob Shaw, who was a classic spitball pitcher from the Braves. And originally Perry thought, geez, they're trading for more pitchers. That's not good. That's hurting my odds. But Shaw took a liking to Gaylord and taught him the spitball. There was this dramatic doubleheader against the Mets in 1964, where the second game, this was the longest doubleheader in Major League history in terms of actual time, almost 10 hours of game time. It was the 13th inning. Perry's the last pitcher on the staff. The manager, Alvin Dark, who strongly disliked Gaylord, had no choice but to bring him in. And that was really the first time that, out of sheer desperation, that he started throwing the spitball. And sure enough, that night he threw 10 innings of shutout ball, throwing the spitter for the first time, and that's what really launched his career as a spitballer. It still took him another couple of years to truly master the pitch. And by master, you mean being confident in throwing it at crucial times in games where you really have sort of full confidence in the pitch.
Well, for a long time, Perry is literally throwing a spitball. I mean, putting his saliva on the ball and throwing it that way until they change the rules on him.
The spitball, there's really sort of three eras, the spitball. There's this era through the 1967 season where it's truly a spitball in most cases. I mean, some pitchers are cutting the ball with their belt buckle and like, but most of them are using their saliva. But the Major League Baseball makes it in an effort to cut down or eliminate the spitball, makes it illegal after the 1967 season to go to your mouth while you're on the mound.
Right.
Which before you could go to your mouth on the mound as long as you visibly wiped off. But of course, the spitballers could wipe off and just lift their index finger and middle finger, just barely lift it, above to sort of keep the spit there.
Yeah.
But then they all had to, because of that rule change, go to some other form of lubrication, be it Vaseline or KY jelly or all kinds of stuff. And they had to make that transformation in one off season. And it was by this time, Gaylord was completely reliant on spitball. It was a extremely anxious time for him to transform to grease, as they call it. And then after the 73 season, that's what brought out, the classic where the umpires would go to the mound and inspect him, trying to find the spot, if you will, where he's hiding the grease. But of course, Gaylord could see that the game was in front of him while he was on the mound, and he could tell when the managers were freaking out about it, and the manager would have to walk, to the umpire and, demand that the umpire go out and inspect him. The umpire has to walk 60 feet, 6 inches to get to the mound. So he had plenty of time to wipe off, as they say. And then it became a circus, and caused the delays in games and like. And at the end of the 73 season, the rule changed again. It was amended again. So the umpire didn't have to actually find the lubricant. They could actually use their judgment as to whether or not the pitcher was throwing the pitch. And then again, that threw Gaylord for a loop. But it turns out that umpires didn't really want that responsibility. They started that spring training, right? You're supposed to call the first time you call it's supposed to be a ball, and the second time you're supposed to eject the pitcher from the game. And in spring training, they started to do that. But when they did that, the umpire became the story after the game. The reporters would surround them and ask them questions. They didn't want any part of it. So as far as I could tell, only 2 pitchers were ejected from games for throwing a grease ball over the next 10 years. One of them was Don Sutton in 78, I believe, and one was Gaylord, but not until 1982. But they never actually found tangible evidence.
Well, the thing is, everyone knows he's throwing it, but they can't prove it.
And he's himself is above board about it. I mean, the license plate of his car read Spitter. You didn't have to hide it.
And he had a book. He had a book that he wrote in the 1970s, didn't it?
And a book where he claimed to have quit, but the book is really sort of tongue in cheek and hilarious, actually. I mean, of course, the book's written by a side reporter, but it's you can tell it's got Gaylord's voice in it. He's a confessed cheater,
right? Well, if you look at Perry on YouTube or somewhere else online, see that old footage of him pitching. It's really kind of funny because he's doing all these movements. He's going to the brim of his cap. He's going to his ears. He's going kind of all over the place. And a lot of time he wasn't about to throw a spitter doing that. He was just doing it to mess with the batter's head and really psych him out.
To break the hitter's concentration.
Yeah.
Hitting, of course, entails tremendous concentration. And if you can just break that a little bit, you're really giving yourself an edge.
I mean, Perry today would be the game's worst nightmare, not just because of the spitter, but because he kind of took his time on the mound with all these movements that he's doing. It's kind of an OCD type of thing as he prepares to throw his next pitch. And the obsession with speed now, they would definitely be wanting to speed him up.
Well, but there was this recent, what they call it, sticky stuff,
right?
Scandal, where that's to increase your spin rate. But actually, the spitter has the exact opposite objective. The spitter is such that the objective is to have as little spin as possible on the ball. The spitter, instead of the ball rolling off your index finger and middle fingers, it creates backspin and spin rate. The ball rolls off your thumb instead, and so there's almost no spin to it. It has the same speed as a fastball. Some people think it's an off-speed pitch, but it's the same speed as a fastball.
Okay.
Because there's no spin on it, by the time it gets to the plate and gravity does its thing, pitch that a fastball looks like, for all the world, like a fastball that's coming in waist high or thigh high. By the time it gets to the plate, just drops off the table. There's not a whole lot of video out there of Gaylord, but there you can see the last pitch of his 1968 no-hitter, which is against the Cardinals, and Curt Flood is the batter. And his catcher, you can see kind of the action of it, of the pitch as it comes in and just vanishes. And
yeah,
they said when he had it going, you couldn't hit it with a door, less a bat. And then, he didn't, of course, admit it then, but that game, all but 4 of his 90-some pitches were spitters.
He called it a super sinker.
A number of things. At first he called it hard slider. There's always sort of pseudonyms for it. And so it's also so that the players knew kind of what to call it.
You have a great anecdote, you have a great story in this book about his daughter who was asked about the greaser at one point in his career. Why don't you tell that story about his daughter and the sports writer?
Oh, yes, the daughter. His daughter's like 5 years old. This is at the All-Star game in, I think, 1970. And the reporters surround his daughter and they say, your father throws, a grease ball. Where does he hide? Do you know where he hides the grease? And the daughter says, yeah, where? It's in the garage. And they kept pressing her. And they said, your father throws a spitter. And she said, no, it's a hard slider. She's like 5 years old. It's just hilarious.
Yeah, I love that anecdote. So yeah, she was well trained. Yeah, so he did struggle for a few years. And one thing again, I liked about the book, I know he's going to be a 300 game winner. I know he's going to be a Hall of Famer, but the struggles were real those first few years until he kind of masters the spitball. But even then, as you say, not anybody can throw it. He has to really learn how to throw this, and it did put a certain stress on your arm. Is that right?
You have to have really strong hands because you hold the ball really out toward the tips of your fingers, and he would describe it as you squeeze it like you're squeezing an orange. Is the way he put it.
Okay.
The ball rolls off the thumb. And he would call it, like when you're squirting a wet watermelon seed between your fingers. That was the sort of analogy. So his strength, which comes naturally, but also from his upbringing on the farm, and his continuing to be a farmer in the off season, just to really helped him. We talked about his innings.
Yeah.
He used to claim, he liked to claim that he only missed 2 starts, but he actually missed only 6 starts his entire 22-year career, and he never had a sore arm.
It's astounding. And you talk about this crazy, hot ice or whatever he put on his arm every game.
Yes.
Cream.
the brand name is the Capsulin,
Okay.
and it's an ointment made from red hot chili peppers. And he was introduced to it at the '66 All-Star game because Sandy Koufax, that was his last year. Koufax would get his arm rubbed down with this tremendous heat and smell, and Gaylord would walk by, and but he got this. He thought, wow, that would allow me. He was already a sort of natural heavy sweater, and he said that would allow me. And sweat was good for him, and sweat mixed with whether it was spit or grease.
Yeah.
That would allow me to sweat even in these freezing cold nights at Candlestick Park. And for the rest of his career, the trainer would rub, wearing gloves and stuff. The trainer didn't even want to get a drop of it on his skin.
Yeah.
Rub down his upper part of his body with this capsulin oil that, 2 tubes to start the game. So it just goes to show you how dependent he was on on the spitter, and to what extreme that he would go. And of course, that impressed his teammates. And there was this marvelous scene when he got traded from Cleveland to Texas that I'd found where the trainer actually takes this big box full of gloves and tubes and stuff and hands it to the trainer of his new team and explains to him the process. It was just hilarious.
Yeah. It was interesting. You learned it from Koufax, who had a much better fastball, but also didn't last as long. He kind of blew his arm out.
Yeah, he needed this. He needed the heat from the capsulin to keep his arm loose.
Does anybody still use that? Do you know, or something like that?
I don't think so. I mean, things are so much more closely monitored.
Yeah.
Today, and today they would have 20 different cameras focused on Perry. He wouldn't be able to get away with it.
And honestly, I didn't really understand the whole sticky stuff obsession over the last few. I guess they didn't do it so much last year, but it seemed around the time COVID happened, they were obsessed with finding it on pitchers and checking after every inning or whatever.
So now it's just routine that 2 or 3 times during the game, when the pitcher is finished their inning, they have to go straight to the umpire, and the umpire checks their glove and their hands to see if they don't have any sticky stuff.
Yeah.
Well, as we kind of head toward the end of our podcast here, maybe we can talk about the ethics of all this, because Notorious is in the subtitle of your book. Perry was definitely a controversial figure, even though they couldn't catch him throwing the spitball. Everyone knew he was throwing it, and he definitely walked this line in terms of sports ethics about, how okay is it to break certain rules. And later we would get all these scandals with performance enhancing drugs that was really in a virus in baseball for a while. So in some ways, Perry kind of harkens back to a more innocent time, but he was controversial, and we're going to get these later scandals years later after he retires. So maybe just kind of talk about the ethics of all this, where you come down on it. Do you think what he did was okay? Did it bother you? Just talk about that, his legacy.
That makes sense, what I'm asking.
Well, I mean, I sort of come clean about that at the end.
Yeah.
In the epilogue, but over the course of the book, I don't know, just like I'd be writing about any other historical figure. My aim is not to preach,
right,
but to analyze, and present sort of a balanced picture of his successes, his failures, his personal struggles before, during, and after baseball. It's not openly judgmental.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose one could infer that since I'm not making a judgment, that there's a certain amount of tacit approval of it. It's just, the thing is that the spitter was part of the game.
Yeah.
And even his most fervent critics, people like Reggie Jackson and Bobby Mercer and Billy Martin and Ralph Howe, in the off season would hit about it. It's until the performance enhancing drugs era. I mean, really, no one, sports writers and like, wrote about cheating as some sort of moral wrong. It was this kind of cheating. It was part of the game, and if you got away with it, all the better. These are, professionals. It's not like you're cheating. If you cheat, in a card game or something, that you're a cheater. But if you throw a spitball, you're trying to win. You're trying to win because you're trying to feed your family, and you're trying to. Winning is ultimately the only ethic that matters. That was a very common perception until steroids. And steroids changed how people look at cheating. Just the visualness of people like, Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, the assault on the record books. If steroids had only made them a little bit better, probably nobody would have cared. But of course, it allowed them to obliterate home run records and strikeout records, and it's injecting this harmful substance into your bodies. And once the Mitchell report, came out and implemented all these people, I write about in the epilogue is the very famous sports writer Tom Boswell for the Washington Post, who I think epitomized this. He used to write about. I think he wrote a whole book even about cheating that had a sort of, boys will be boys theme to it. And isn't it clever how they cheat, that sort of thing. But that changed after the PED era, and so the way that people viewed Gaylord changed after the PED era. And in fact, there were plenty of people, even to this day, who come out. So this is especially true when the results of the Hall of Fame voting comes out, and of course Bonds and Clemens were denied last year for the 10th time and are no longer on the ballot anymore. And defenders of them would say often, well, Gaylord Perry's in the Hall of Fame, and he was not only a cheater, he was a professed cheater. So everybody it's a very subjective judgment, and even a moral judgment, and everybody has to come to terms with that themselves. But in the I believe the epilogue of the book, I finally sort of state my opinion about it and say that I think you really have to draw a line between, as a historian, have to draw a line between spitball and PEDs. Again, because spitball was an accepted part of the game. Nobody openly defends PED.
Yeah.
It's different. It's like not every cheater isn't like every other cheater. There's a difference.
Well, and where the line gets kind of obliterated is the fact that these guys who are taking the human growth hormone are literally changing their bodies in a noticeable, a dramatic way, batters and pitchers too. And certainly Perry was not changing his body at the time he was throwing the spitter. So the PED scandals were definitely a different thing.
I mean, he was using, especially true when he's using his own spit.
Right.
A little bit of an argument when he's using a different, a substance that comes out of a tube.
Sure.
People will say, well, they took amphetamines in those days. Again, it's a moral judgment. It is a double standard. Life's a double standard. Life's not fair. And I don't think any of us really knows how they would vote, if given the opportunity, how we would vote on people for the Hall of Fame, particularly people like Bonds and Clemens.
Yeah.
You actually had a ballot in your hands. I don't think you could really know. I mean, I think eventually eventually it will be so far in the past that maybe they'll get in 20 years from now on one of these veterans committee things. But they didn't get in. They didn't get anywhere near close this recent vote on the veteran committees. In fact, those veteran committees voted against them even more heavily than the writers.
Bob Costas has talked about this, but these guys like Bonds and Clemens, some other folks, they were probably Hall of Fame caliber players already. If they had just played it clean, they would probably have been in the Hall of Fame on the first ballot or later. But they just got really greedy, and they had to be superhuman, and they had to put up these stats that are just, up till then were just unobtainable.
But you can understand from their perspective, the allure of it.
Yeah.
Because, and of course, it doesn't, they still have to hit the ball and pitch the ball. I mean, it's still incredible talents, but the endurance that it built into them, the power that it must have, given them, the feeling of power, feeling of control. You can see how it'd be easily seduced by it.
Well, one of the ironies with baseball ethics now is a lot of these guys who were kept out of the Hall of Fame because of betting on baseball. A guy like Pete Rose, a guy like Shoeless Joe Jackson, they're still not in the Hall of Fame, but pretty much every other ad on TV now during a baseball game is for sports betting. So it's kind of ironic that they've been banned from the Hall of Fame, but sports betting is big business now. So I don't know, maybe eventually they'll be let in, because what they were doing didn't have anything to do with what they were doing on the field itself. It was getting involved in gambling, and Shoeless Joe, I'm not sure about, but he might not have had anything to do with throwing that World Series. So, attitudes have definitely changed on gambling.
Yeah. Again, it's everybody has to come to terms with it.
Yeah.
Their own process, their own thinking process.
And I think, in talking about recent scandals like with the Astros and the sign stealing, I maybe fall more in the line of like, well, that's part of the game, is stealing signs, right? I mean, they're meant to be stolen. That's why they're hidden.
They were using, high-tech equipment.
Yeah.
They were actually decoding the signs through computer programs. It was both high-tech and then extremely low-tech with the banging of the garbage can. But I think that the amount of attention that got was in part because it comes in the wake of PEDs. People are sort of sensitized to that kind of explicit cheating, even though I think you'd be a fool not to think that it's still going on in some other capacity. Again, because if it helps you win and make money, boys will be boys. I mean, that's you'd be foolish to think otherwise.
Well, as you make clear in the book, baseball has always been changing rules. We've had a bunch of rule changes in the last couple of years to speed up the game, to get more hitting. In Perry's time in 1968, they raised the pitcher's mound. Nobody could hit, so they lowered the mound the next year. And, baseball's always been changing, obviously. A lot of these rules, might be instituted for a while and then they're abandoned and they're changed. In some ways, the game has gotten better. Some ways it's gotten worse. But what do you think of the game today?
So I don't really like the game. The current game.
Talk about that.
I mean, just in a number of ways. I'm not a big fan of all the sabermetrics. Maybe that's just a function of my age, but especially the emphasis on power. Power, both from hitter's perspective and the pitcher's perspective. There's so little strategy involved in games anymore. So the subtlety of the game is gone. Pitchers now, in Perry's day, pitchers were expected to go the distance. I mean, it was unmanly not to go the distance. And
right.
To go the distance, you have to go through the lineup at least at least, 4 or 5 times. And so you have to strategize. You can't just throw everything out there the first time through. You have to save stuff, and you have to realize that the pitchers are going to see you the first time around, second time around. You're going to have to give them something different the third time around, the fourth time around. Again, this sort of strategy and the subtlety that gives baseball its really distinction doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I watched the World Series and I watched the playoffs during the season. Though it's really rare that I'll actually sit down and watch a whole game. But once I'm watching the playoffs and the World Series, it'll be like the first two batters will get on, and my mind is saying, "Bunt! It's time to bunt."
Right.
Like these players have no idea how to bunt. So even when the strategy would call for it, they don't know how. They can't possibly. So that's why the Yankees and the Phillies have struck out over 60 times each in 6 games against the Astros. It's strikeouts and homers, and it just the game is boring to me. I much prefer living in. Since I'm a historian, I can live in the past and cheat a little bit that way. The game is just much more fascinating to me in this earlier era than it is now.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, and I drive my wife nuts because I do complain a lot about that, like lack of fundamentals and just how frustrating it is to watch a game.
Lack of fundamentals is another thing. I mean, hitting the cutoff man, that kind of thing. I mean, it's just a different game.
But yeah, like you say, like just, bunting is kind of a thing of the past. And even with the DH, everybody has the DH now. They still can't hit.
Or hit and runs never happens.
Yeah.
And especially in the playoffs and World Series when every run matters. It's just, though, again, I like to use the word nuance, because the nuances of the game are gone, and it makes it a much more, it's just the word that comes to mind is boring.
Right.
A thinker's game. And there's not much to think about.
Yeah, I watched a lot of baseball last season, but it could be really boring because, like you say, just they strike out a lot, and so they're killing rallies. They're just not doing anything with guys on base. I see it again and again. Well, one of the things I notice about baseball now is just how inconsistent it is. Either players or teams. One day a team will get 27 hits or something, and the next day they'll get almost no hit or whatever. And players are the same way. They'll just seem like they can't hit the side of a barn, and then the next day they're just doing these superhuman feats, and it's better than it's ever been, I guess, and it's also worse than it's ever been, which that's understandable, but it's also just very frustrating as a fan to see a team that can be so different day to day, maybe beat up on one team and can't do anything against another. It's just, that's one of the things I've noticed about the game is how awful certain people can look one day and just how amazing they can be the next. You never know who's going to show up.
The athleticism of the players is in a way much higher.
Yeah.
Baseball is always not just about being athletic. It was outthinking the other team at multiple levels.
Yeah.
And now it's just become much more bland.
Yeah. Well, to wrap up, you're working on a project now on Bob Feller. Is that right?
Yeah.
How's that going?
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard because it's always hard to start a project.
Yeah.
No matter how many times I've started a project,
Right.
It's hard. It's hard emotionally. You never really know, do I really have something here or not? So you have to spend all this time in this sea of ambiguity and even self-doubt and whatnot. And it's also hard because it's from a much earlier era, but that sort of straddles World War II, and I don't know the players.
Yeah.
Whereas in Perry's time, it was really rare, no matter what I was reading, it was really rare that I didn't recognize the players and could sort of place them and know what kind of a hitter they were, that kind of thing. Whereas I don't know any of these. It's really starting from scratch, so it's difficult.
Yeah.
In that regard, and therefore difficult means also good because it's challenging and it's fresh, and you need challenge and freshness to keep going.
And he comes out of your first book on baseball, right? You mentioned he was in there.
Yeah, he was. He was. So I had sort of a head start in the same way that I had a head start with Gaylord. It's also more difficult because there's very little written about Perry other than contemporary sports writers, whereas there's been tons written about Feller. Most of it mired in mythology. So you sort of parse out myth from reality. That makes it fun. But he's a mythological figure. I mean, he's 17 years old before his senior year in high school when he breaks in with Cleveland and actually ties the single game American League strikeout record. 17 as again a 17-year-old chubby faced, no facial hair, farm boy, just a fascinating figure. And it's really the speed at which he threw the ball it's just mind blowing.
And do you think you'll kind of take the same track with him, kind of a full scale biography?
That's the plan.
Yeah. And where is he from?
A little town called Van Meter, Iowa.
Iowa.
Which is, just to the just west of Des Moines.
Okay. So I'm guessing similar to Perry, farm guy.
Yeah, different though. I mean, different.
Yeah.
But he is a farm boy.
Yeah. So
And
you think
he
you'll be
was
making?
from Van Meter is what his nickname was.
Okay. You're going to be making some trips to Iowa soon?
Oh, I already have.
Okay. Have you seen the Field of Dreams field? You ever seen that?
I haven't actually seen it.
Okay.
But Field of Dreams is overblown. I mean, everybody, and especially farm kids, they all built their own field, their own
Yeah.
in the fields. I mean, it wasn't like hardly the first time it was done. It was commonplace.
Yeah. All right. Well, good luck with that. And
I'll need it.
the next 10 years spoken for is a
Probably.
yeah, no, I feel you. But yeah, again, congratulations on the book on Perry. It's really good and tons of details. So I think obviously anyone who's into baseball, but I think you're also kind of coming at Southern history from a different angle too. So there's just so much great stuff in there. So this is my first baseball podcast, which I'm very pleased about. So thanks for sitting down and talking with me today.
You bet. I really appreciate your interest in the book.
Okay, that was my talk with David Vaught. I hope you enjoyed that. Once again, his book is Spitter, Baseball's Notorious Gaylord Perry, and it is available from Texas A&M University Press. You can get it on Amazon for $30.62 hardcover. That is the price as of January 24th when I'm recording this. And of course, you get free delivery with that, and you can get the Kindle for $9.99. So check that out. A very well-researched and written book that gives an interesting look at a pitcher that I didn't know a whole lot about. So it was fun talking with David about Gaylord Perry. And pitchers and catchers are reporting mid-February, so we're about 3 weeks away, I guess. Depends on your team, but I think the Red Sox is February 15th, but others are the 16th and 17th for the position players. So just a couple more weeks and spring training will begin. So excited about the new season. It hasn't been a particularly harsh winter here, but January sucks and feels like it goes on forever, and we still have another week. So once we get into February, I usually feel a little bit better, because even if February sucks too, it's a short month. But yeah, baseball will be here before you know it. Happy New Year to you all, and I will have another podcast very soon. I have a talk coming up with a local record store guy. That was fun. That was an in-person one. Haven't done that in a while. So I'll be coming at you with more conversation soon. All right. Take care. Bye.